This story is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. Names, characters, locations, and events are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The content contains horror, suspense, and mature themes, including psychological and supernatural elements. Viewer discretion is advised. The fog rolled across the hills in thick, suffocating waves as the lone car approached the iron gates of St. Mary's Convent. The trees surrounding the estate were gnarled and lifeless, their skeletal branches clawing at the mist as though warning unwelcome visitors to turn back. Claire Bennett, a young journalist in her late 20s, gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had received an anonymous tip about the disappearance of several nuns from the convent, a secret that had been buried by the local community for decades. Her editor had warned her that the story would be dangerous, but curiosity burned hotter than fear in Claire's veins. As the car's headlights pierced the mist, the convent emerged. A sprawling Gothic structure of crumbling stone, ivy creeping up its walls like black veins. The windows were dark, almost hollow, except for a dim flicker from the tower's topmost chamber. The iron gates creaked open on their own as if the estate recognized her arrival. Claire hesitated for a moment, a shiver running down her spine. There was something alive in the silence, something that watched and waited. She turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold night, her boots crunching against the frost-covered gravel. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mold, incense, and something she could not identify. The main hall was vast, echoing her every step. Wooden pews lay scattered, and faded portraits of stern-faced nuns lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. Claire's flashlight beam caught a carved plaque above a doorway. Obedience, silence, and faith. A sudden draft made her shiver, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. Claire's research had revealed that the convent had been home to St. Mary's Order for over a century, but in recent decades, it had grown infamous for unexplained disappearances. 3 nuns had vanished within the last 5 years, and rumors whispered of dark rituals and secret passages within the convent's walls. Yet the local villagers, fearful of the church's influence, refused to speak about it. Claire knew she was stepping into a place where superstition and history intertwined, and somewhere beneath the stone and shadow, the truth waited, twisted, hidden, and malevolent. As she explored the main hall, Claire's footsteps echoed unnaturally loudly. She passed the chapel, where candle stubs still sat in dusty holders, their wax hardened over the years. Kneeling in the center of the room, a single figure appeared in her peripheral vision. She spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only silence. She found a stairwell leading downward, its entrance half hidden behind a tattered tapestry. A chill emanated from the darkness below, pulling her forward against her better judgment. The stone steps groaned under her weight as she descended, each footstep amplifying the oppressive weight of the air. At the bottom, she found a long corridor, lined with doors. Some were slightly ajar, revealing empty rooms filled with broken furniture and decayed mattresses. The smell was stronger here, metallic, like blood mixed with rust. Claire's flashlight flickered as she reached the last door. The handle was cold, almost icy, and when she pushed it open, she found a small, circular room with walls etched in strange symbols. The markings were crude but precise, drawn in something that glinted under the flashlight's beam. A thin layer of dust covered the floor, but faint footprints led to the center, where a dark stain marred the stone. She knelt to inspect it, then froze. The stain seemed fresh, as if the floor itself remembered the terror that had occurred here. Suddenly, she heard the faintest whisper, almost inaudible, curling around her ears. "Leave now." The voice was hollow, echoing off the stone walls, but no one was there. Her pulse quickened. She scanned the room and noticed a trapdoor beneath the symbol-stained floor, partially hidden under a rug. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed for her to leave, but the journalist in her would not relent. Claire pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase descending further into darkness. The air smelled worse here, thick with decay and a sense of oppression so heavy that it felt like it could suffocate her. Taking a deep breath, she descended, each step colder and more ominous than the last. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding what appeared to be centuries-old relics, rotted books, and strange effigies of saints twisted into grotesque forms. And then she saw them, the nuns, or what remained of them. Their faces were pale and frozen in terror, their bodies positioned in unnatural postures, as if they had been placed here intentionally. Claire staggered back, her flashlight trembling in her hands. A sudden movement caught her eye. One of the figures blinked. Not humanly, but mechanically, unervingly. A low, guttural chant filled the chamber, though she saw no one. From the shadows, a figure emerged. A nun, or what she thought was a nun, her habit torn, eyes hollow and black as coal. The air thickened, and a cold laughter echoed around the chamber, a sound that did not belong to the living. Claire stumbled backward, her mind racing to comprehend what she was seeing. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing in rhythm with the chant. She realized then that this convent was no longer a place of worship. It was a tomb, a trap, a vessel for something that had consumed the souls of those who had once lived here. Her instincts screamed to escape, yet she could not tear her eyes away. The figure began to approach, moving in unnatural jerks, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Claire's flashlight flickered violently, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged, and she turned, racing up the spiraling staircase, tripping over her own feet, only to find the trapdoor shut above her. The chanting grew louder, closer, as if the very walls themselves were closing in. At that moment, Claire understood the horrifying truth. The convent was alive, and it had no intention of letting her leave. Mary's had been a prison for centuries, its walls feeding on the fear and faith of those who lived within. And now, she had become the newest prey in a story of horror that had been waiting, silently, for decades. Claire's lungs burned as she scrambled up the staircase, slamming her hands against the trapdoor. It refused to budge, the ancient wood unyielding beneath her frantic strength. Panic clawed at her chest, but a flicker of determination forced her to search for another exit. The dim light of her flashlight revealed a narrow side corridor leading back toward the main hall. She didn't know if it would lead outside, but any direction was better than remaining trapped below with whatever had been waiting in that chamber. As she crept along the corridor, the faint chanting persisted, a low, rhythmic hum vibrating through the floorboards. It was now unmistakable. Multiple voices, layered and distorted, overlapping in a tone that made her teeth ache. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the stone walls, making the very air tremble. Every instinct screamed for her to run, yet a journalist's compulsion to uncover the truth pushed her forward. She followed the noise, winding through a maze of halls and staircases, until she reached a large, iron-bound door. The door was slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light spilled from the crack, and the chanting intensified. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. What she had glimpsed in the lower chamber had been horrifying enough, yet something told her that the core of the convent's horror awaited behind this door. With a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was enormous, stretching further than the structure above suggested. High vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows, and rows of pews faced a raised dais at the far end. What made Claire's stomach churn was the sight of dozens of figures. Nuns, dressed in tattered habits, kneeling in unison, heads bowed. Their skin was ghostly pale, faces hollowed and gaunt, eyes occasionally flickering open with unnatural intensity. At the center of the dais stood a figure in a darker habit, taller, commanding, her face obscured by shadow. She raised her arms, and the chanting intensified, echoing as though multiplied by some unseen force. Claire's breath caught. The nuns' voices were perfectly synchronized, yet none of their lips moved. It was impossible. The realization struck her. These were not living women. They were vessels, puppets animated by some force that had taken control of their bodies. Her flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch, crawling along the walls like black liquid. A sudden movement drew her attention to the dais. The central figure began to descend slowly, her hands trailing over the backs of the kneeling nuns as though drawing energy from them. With every step, the room seemed to contract, the air growing colder, heavier. Claire stumbled backward, almost knocking over a pew, but she caught herself, heart hammering. She had to understand, had to know what had possessed this place. She scanned the room and noticed a small doorway on the far side, partially hidden behind a heavy tapestry depicting the convent's crest. Summoning courage, she moved toward it, careful to stay in the shadows. As she passed the rows of unnaturally silent nuns, she realized they weren't entirely mindless. Their heads followed her every move, their hollow eyes tracking her in unison. Every instinct screamed for her to run, yet she edged closer to the hidden door, hoping it led to a safe exit or at least answers. Pushing through the tapestry, she entered a narrow spiral staircase leading downward once again. The air grew colder, damp with an earthy scent that reminded her of graves. At the bottom, she emerged in a crypt-like chamber, walls lined with stone sarcophagi. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames flickering despite the absence of wind. In the center lay an open coffin, and inside was a manuscript, its pages yellowed and brittle. Claire approached carefully, lifting the manuscript. The pages were filled with strange symbols, diagrams of human figures, and annotations in a delicate, looping script. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized repeated references to the choir, the vessel, and the keeper. The notes described rituals intended to bind spirits to living flesh, to create eternal obedience through fear and manipulation. Her hands trembled as she turned page after page, realizing that the convent's hierarchy had not only hidden these horrors, they had participated in them generation after generation. A sudden sound made her spin. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the crypt. Claire swallowed hard, hiding the manuscript beneath her coat. From the shadows, the taller figure she had seen earlier emerged, the central nun, or perhaps something far older and darker than human. Her face was now partially visible, revealing hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a permanent, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, the voice echoing in multiple tones, overlapping with itself unnaturally. Claire backed toward the staircase, feeling the cold stone walls closing in. The figure advanced, her movements unervingly fluid, defying natural human motion. Claire could hear the faintest rustle, like wings brushing against stone, though no one else was visible. Every step she took seemed to summon the shadows closer, the candlelight flickering violently. In a panic, Claire bolted up the staircase, clutching the manuscript. She emerged into a narrow corridor she hadn't explored before, the chanting from the upper hall growing louder, angrier. Her flashlight caught movement in the shadows. Dozens of eyes, hollow and black, staring at her from the darkness. The nuns' voices, now a cacophony of whispers and screams, merged with the sound of doors slamming above her. She realized the convent was alive, not just metaphorically, but in a literal sense. Its walls pulsed with energy, feeding on the fear and desperation of those trapped within. Claire's mind raced. She had to escape, but every exit seemed blocked or twisted, leading her deeper into the labyrinthine horrors of the convent. The manuscript offered clues, symbols indicating hidden passages, secret rooms, and arcane wards, but she needed time to decipher them. And time was something St. Mary's would not allow. The central figure was hunting her, her presence a shadow over every corridor, every stairwell. As she pressed forward, Claire felt a cold breath against her neck and heard the whisper again. "You cannot leave. Not until the choir has sung." She stumbled into a room filled with broken mirrors, their surfaces reflecting her image in dozens of twisted, distorted ways. In one reflection, she saw not herself, but a hollow-eyed nun, kneeling and chanting, bound by invisible chains. The realization hit her with a bone-deep chill. This was the fate of anyone who entered the convent without permission. The choir, the possessed nuns, the keeper, the rituals, was a trap that had ensnared souls for decades. And now, Claire Bennett, brave, curious, and determined, had become a part of its story. The shadows shifted, merging into forms that resembled the nuns she had seen, closing the exits, surrounding her. Her flashlight flickered one last time before plunging her into darkness. The chanting reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the walls, her chest, her mind. Panic threatened to consume her, but Claire clenched her jaw, refusing to surrender. Somewhere in this nightmare, there had to be a way out. Claire's hands shook as she pressed herself against the cracked stone wall, trying to steady her racing heart. The flickering candlelight and shadows in the room of broken mirrors had shown her only one terrifying truth. The choir's power was not recent. It had been cultivated over centuries. But how? And why? The manuscript she had stolen contained hints, cryptic annotations that seemed to pulse with malevolence, almost alive. As she leafed through the fragile pages again, she discovered the beginnings of St. Mary's Convent, long before the disappearances made the local village fearful. It had been founded in the early 1700s by a mysterious abbess known only as Mother Elara. Unlike other convents, St. Mary's had not been dedicated solely to worship and service. Claire's notes revealed that Mother Elara had dabbled in forbidden practices, drawing upon ancient rituals from Europe and the Middle East. Rituals designed to bind spirits, twist faith into obedience, and convert mortal women into eternal vessels for otherworldly entities. Her mind shivered at the words. The choir wasn't just a collection of missing nuns. It was a centuries-old experiment in possession, control, and immortality. The manuscript contained drawings depicting the stages of transformation. First, the nuns were isolated and forced to meditate in silence, stripped of all earthly comforts. Then, through incantations and ritualistic ceremonies, their spirits were slowly tethered to the convent itself, making them vessels for the keeper, a dark entity whose presence lingered like a shadow over every stone of the building. The keeper, according to the manuscript, was a being older than the convent itself, possibly summoned by Mother Elara through an unholy covenant. Its form was ever-changing, sometimes visible as a figure in a black habit, sometimes as an amalgamation of shadows and whispers. The purpose of the choir, the manuscript explained, was to amplify its power. The more souls were tethered, the stronger it became, feeding on faith, fear, and devotion twisted into terror. Claire's stomach churned. The writings were precise, almost clinical, yet the terror they invoked was visceral. She could almost feel the keeper's presence pressing down on her, curling around her spine like a living thing. It was a being that did not forgive curiosity. It did not tolerate escape, and it did not rest. A sudden sound behind her made her spin, a metallic scrape echoing from the staircase she had descended. Her flashlight beam trembled as it landed on the walls of the mirror room, revealing faint scratches that hadn't been there before, as if something or someone had marked the walls in haste. The whispers returned, low and urgent, murmuring phrases she could barely comprehend. "The choir is ready," the keeper calls. "Obey or join them." Claire pressed forward, following a narrow corridor the manuscript hinted at, a hidden library beneath the convent, known to Mother Elara as the Sanctum of Silence. The air grew colder with every step, tinged with the metallic tang of old blood and ink. When she reached the heavy wooden door at the corridor's end, she hesitated. This door had been sealed for centuries, but the hinges creaked open as if welcoming her intrusion. Inside, rows of ancient tomes and scrolls lined the shelves. Candles burned eerily, though no wind or source of flame was visible. Claire's flashlight illuminated a pedestal at the center, holding a leather-bound book so old it seemed to exhale the scent of decay and dust. The cover bore a single symbol, a spiral entwined with thorned vines. She approached cautiously and opened the book. The pages revealed detailed accounts of every known disappearance at St. Mary's. Dates, names, even the final whispers of the nuns as they succumbed to the keeper's influence. Each entry grew more sinister, more desperate. The last recorded entry made her blood run cold. The words were written in a trembling hand, presumably the final survivor before the current choir. The keeper watches from the shadows. It knows our thoughts before we do. If you read this, it will come for you too. There is no escape. Claire swallowed hard, her breath fogging in the icy air. She knew the convent had been alive with these horrors long before her arrival, feeding, expanding, consuming. And now the keeper had noticed her presence. She could feel it, the oppressive weight pressing down, the whispers that seemed to pierce her mind directly. She backed away from the pedestal, trying to leave the library, but the doorway had vanished. In its place, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into blackness. Desperate, Claire descended. The air grew thick, and a low chant began to echo around her. Not human voices this time, but something else. An ancient, guttural vibration that resonated deep in her bones. Her flashlight flickered, revealing walls carved with faces. Faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The keeper had left its mark here, generations of terror pressed into the stone itself. At the bottom, she found a cavernous chamber illuminated by faint red light. In the center, a circle of nuns knelt, their heads bowed, silent. The central figure, the keeper in its black habit, hovered above them. Its form pulsed, flickering between shadow and flesh. Claire froze, realizing that the nuns were still alive in some sense. The keeper had not fully consumed them yet, but their minds were gone. They existed only to serve, to chant, to feed the power of the entity. A sudden movement to her left made her spin. A young nun, one of the missing, stepped out from the shadows. Her eyes were hollow, yet a flicker of recognition remained. She whispered, barely audible, "You shouldn't be here. It will take you too." The words were half warning, half plea. Claire tried to respond, but the air thickened around her, making it hard to speak. The keeper's presence intensified, a pressure that pressed on her chest like iron bands. Claire realized that escape would not be simple. The convent itself was a living labyrinth, twisting hallways, shifting doors, and hidden chambers designed to trap anyone who dared enter. And the choir, bound to the keeper, acted as both sentinel and predator, ensuring that no one could leave once they had crossed the threshold. Her journalistic instincts battled with sheer terror. She needed evidence, proof of what had happened here, if she were ever to make it out alive. The manuscript and the books provided knowledge, but knowledge was not enough. The keeper would not tolerate exposure, and the choir would act to prevent it. Every step she took, every sound she made, risked awakening the full force of the entity. Claire realized that her investigation had evolved from documenting disappearances to surviving them. She could not simply report the story. She had to become part of it, navigate its horrors, and find a way to disrupt the ancient rituals that had ensnared countless souls over centuries. And in that moment, deep in the heart of St. Mary's, she understood that the keeper's hunger was eternal, and it would not rest until she, too, became part of its choir. Claire's hands trembled as she held the ancient manuscript tight against her chest. The cavern beneath St. Mary's had revealed horrors she could barely comprehend. Yet somewhere in the notes, she found faint references to escape routes. Hidden stairways, concealed doors, and crypts that had once been used for secret rituals. These passages had been carefully erased from the main floor plans, left only as cryptic symbols and annotations in the manuscripts left by previous generations of nuns. Every step she took along the cold stone corridors felt like walking through the veins of a living beast. The keeper's presence pulsed through the walls, and the air itself seemed to resist her. She pressed her ear to the damp walls, straining to hear over the distant whispers and low chanting of the choir above. Every sound echoed unnaturally, distorted, almost as though the convent itself were listening and reacting to her heartbeat. Following the symbols from the manuscript, she found a small alcove hidden behind a crumbling stone relief of the Virgin Mary. Beneath the relief was a narrow slot, just wide enough for her hand. Claire slid her fingers into it and pushed, and with a grinding creak, a hidden door swung open. A rush of cold, fetid air escaped the opening, carrying the unmistakable stench of decay and incense. Beyond lay a narrow passageway, its stone walls carved with intricate runes, pulsating faintly under her flashlight. She stepped inside cautiously. The corridor twisted and turned, leading downward into the earth, deeper than she had expected. Along the walls, faint etchings depicted scenes of rituals. Nuns kneeling in concentric circles, their faces contorted in fear, the keeper hovering above them like a shadow with teeth. Claire realized these depictions were not just warnings. They were instructions, blueprints for the ceremonies that had bound the choir and strengthened the keeper over centuries. The passage opened into a chamber lit by a single red candle perched atop a stone pedestal. In the center of the room was a circle marked with arcane symbols, the same symbols she had seen in the manuscript. Dust and dried blood coated the floor. Claire knelt to inspect the circle, her fingers tracing the lines, trying to decipher their meaning. The manuscript described them as containment wards, meant to trap spirits temporarily during the rituals, but they had been corrupted by the keeper over the years. As she studied the symbols, a sudden chill enveloped the room. Claire froze, heart hammering. A whisper slithered through the air. "You seek knowledge, but knowledge comes at a price." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the stone chamber, vibrating directly in her mind. She spun around, but the room was empty. Then she noticed movement in the shadows, a faint shimmer as if the very air had weight, a presence manifesting itself slowly, deliberately. Claire realized the keeper was aware of her intrusion. Its power extended through the walls, through the floors, through the very stones of the convent. She needed a plan. Knowledge alone would not save her. She would have to use the keeper's own rules against it. Using the manuscript as her guide, she began to trace a series of protective symbols around herself, improvising from what she had memorized. Each line she etched into the dust seemed to repel the shadows, creating a fragile barrier between her and the encroaching darkness. The chanting above grew louder, more urgent. Claire could feel the choir moving, their hollowed eyes and empty expressions focused on her. They were not attacking yet, but the sense of inevitability was suffocating. She knew that any misstep could draw the keeper's wrath directly down upon her. She needed to find the heart of the choir, the central nexus where the keeper drew its power from the trapped souls. Following the manuscript's clues, Claire discovered a hidden spiral staircase concealed beneath a loose stone slab. She descended, the air growing heavier, thick with the energy of the long-suffering nuns whose souls had been ensnared. The walls of the stairwell were lined with tiny niches, each containing small effigies, decayed rosaries, and fragments of the nuns' belongings. Each item seemed to pulse faintly with residual life, a tether to the souls that still lingered. At the bottom, she found a vast underground hall, the true sanctuary of the keeper. Candles flickered along the walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to twist and move independently of their sources. In the center of the hall, the choir knelt in concentric circles around the keeper, their chants forming an eerie harmonic resonance that shook the stone floor. The keeper hovered above them, a figure of pure shadow, black eyes burning with intelligence and hunger. Claire realized she had only one chance. The manuscript described a method, long forgotten, to sever the keeper's link to the choir temporarily, but it required immense focus and precise execution. Drawing in a deep breath, she began to inscribe the final set of protective symbols on the floor, her hands shaking, her mind racing. As she worked, the keeper's attention shifted toward her, its presence like ice in her veins. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the candles. Darkness swallowed her, and the keeper's voice thundered in her mind. "You cannot defy me." Claire's pulse skyrocketed, but she forced herself to continue, tracing the final symbol with trembling precision. The dust on the floor glimmered faintly as if acknowledging her work, a fragile sign that her wards might hold. The choir's chanting faltered. One by one, the nuns blinked, their movements jerky and unnatural as the keeper's influence wavered. Claire felt a surge of hope. If she could hold the circle long enough, the keeper's power might weaken, even momentarily, giving her the chance to escape. Sweat dripped down her forehead, her hands scraped and bleeding from the stone floor, but she refused to stop. Every second counted, every line drawn a lifeline against the encroaching darkness. Then, from the shadows, a figure lunged. One of the possessed nuns had broken from the circle, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. Instinctively, she slammed her hand onto the protective circle, and the nun recoiled, screaming a soundless, twisted wail. The keeper's form flickered violently, the shadows in the room writhing as if in pain. The barrier held barely, but it held. Claire realized that she had discovered the first real weakness in centuries. The keeper's connection to the choir was not absolute. With focus, knowledge, and courage, it could be disrupted. But she also knew that she had only just begun. The convent had centuries of secrets, traps, and horrors yet to be revealed. Escaping alive and stopping the keeper from claiming more souls would require everything she had and more. As she took a trembling step back, the choir's voices began to regain their harmony. The keeper's shadow stretched toward her, its hunger palpable. Claire knew that she could not linger. She had glimpsed the path forward. A combination of hidden passages, arcane knowledge, and sheer courage would be her only chance to survive. And somewhere deep within St. Mary's, the ultimate confrontation with the keeper awaited. One that would test not only her resolve but the very limits of her humanity. Claire's lungs burned as she crouched behind a crumbling stone pillar in the underground hall. The keeper's shadow stretched across the floor, flickering unnaturally, its presence suffocating. Above her, the choir knelt, their hollow eyes fixed toward the center of the chamber, lips moving in eerie synchronization. Despite the protective symbols she had drawn, the keeper's influence seeped into the edges of her awareness, whispering threats in a voice that felt like ice sliding across her bones. "You cannot resist, you will join them," her mind raced. She had glimpsed part of the manuscript's instructions, enough to disrupt the keeper's link to the choir temporarily. But the ritual had required focus, courage, and timing. One misstep, and she would be absorbed like the nuns before her. Her fingers brushed the floor as she adjusted the protective circle, adding faint symbols gleaned from memory. Every line she etched made the shadows shiver, the chanting faltering slightly. But the keeper's presence only grew stronger, its attention now fully fixed on her. From the shadows, one of the possessed nuns rose. Her movement was jerky, unnatural, yet deliberate. She advanced, hollow eyes flickering in the dim light. Claire held her breath, trying to stay calm. The symbols on the floor glimmered faintly, creating a fragile barrier. As the nun reached the edge, she recoiled, a soundless wail escaping her. Claire realized that the keeper's power depended entirely on the choir's unity. If she could disrupt the harmony, even briefly, she might gain an advantage. Desperation drove Claire forward. She began tracing additional symbols from the manuscript, improvising protective glyphs in the dust. With each line, the keeper's shadow flickered violently, twisting into shapes that defied reality. Some resembling the nuns she had seen, others grotesque amalgamations of shadows and darkness. The air grew thick, pressing against her lungs, but she forced herself to continue, hand shaking as she etched the final symbol. The chanting faltered. A discordant note rose from the choir, their voices clashing in unnatural rhythms. Claire's pulse raced as the keeper's shadow quivered and recoiled slightly, its focus split. She could feel the energy of the convent itself reacting to her actions, the centuries of fear and devotion feeding into a fragile equilibrium. It was enough, just enough, to buy her a moment of clarity. Claire's eyes scanned the chamber, looking for anything that could further weaken the keeper. Her flashlight illuminated an alcove filled with ancient relics, some recognizable as religious artifacts, others twisted into forms she couldn't name. Among them was a small chalice, its surface etched with faint symbols similar to those in the manuscript. According to the text, this chalice had been used in the original rituals to tether the spirits of the choir to the keeper. Destroying it might sever the link permanently, or at least destabilize it long enough for escape. Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire darted toward the alcove. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. Shadows writhed, reaching toward her like tendrils. The nuns, partially freed from the keeper's control by her wards, flickered in and out of motion, some stumbling, some frozen in place. The keeper's attention was split, its form unstable, shifting between shadow and vaguely human outline. Claire grabbed the chalice, feeling a cold, unnatural energy radiating from it. She held it aloft, recalling a passage from the manuscript. To break the chains, the vessel must pierce the heart of the tether. Only then can the choir be freed, and the keeper's power waned. Her hands trembled as she smashed the chalice against the stone floor. A burst of energy erupted, a shockwave of cold and shadow that rippled through the chamber. The choir's discordant voices rose into a deafening scream, and the keeper's form flickered violently, letting out a sound that was neither human nor entirely of this world. The walls of the chamber seemed to breathe, shifting and writhing as the keeper's control weakened. The nuns, momentarily freed from the spell, gasped, their hollow eyes blinking in confusion. Some fell to the floor, overwhelmed by years of possession, while others began to crawl toward the exits that had previously been sealed. Claire realized that the ritual had worked, at least partially. She had disrupted the keeper's influence long enough to give herself and the choir a chance to survive. But the victory was fragile. The keeper recoiled into a shadowed corner, its form condensing into something smaller yet infinitely more menacing. Its presence still dominated the chamber, and Claire knew it would not forgive this interference. She needed to escape before it recovered its full power. With the manuscript clutched in one hand, she guided the partially freed nuns toward the hidden stairways she had discovered, praying that the protective symbols would hold long enough. The descent was harrowing. The keeper's shadow flared intermittently, stretching tendrils that lashed at the walls and floor, trying to snare them. Claire's mind raced as she remembered a diagram from the manuscript, depicting a secondary exit, a forgotten crypt beneath the convent's original foundation. It was a narrow crawlspace, almost impossible to navigate, but it offered the only chance of survival. One by one, the nuns followed her, their movements tentative, unsure whether they were truly free or simply delaying the inevitable. As they approached the entrance to the crypt, the keeper let out a sound that reverberated through the stones, a mixture of rage and sorrow. It was a presence that had been built over centuries, bound to the convent by fear, faith, and ritual. Yet for the first time, Claire saw vulnerability in its form, an opportunity that had never existed before. She could not defeat it entirely, not yet, but she could survive and perhaps reveal its secrets to the world above. Crawling through the narrow passage, the nuns following behind her, Claire felt the weight of centuries pressing against her. Every step forward was a defiance of the keeper's ancient power. She whispered encouragement to the nuns, guiding them with whatever strength remained. The shadows flared behind them, the keeper's form writhing in fury, but the protective symbols and her knowledge of the rituals held it at bay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the crawlspace opened into an abandoned crypt beneath the convent's chapel. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the stone ceiling, illuminating the chamber with an ethereal glow. Claire and the nuns collapsed, exhausted but alive. The keeper's influence weakened, if not entirely gone. The manuscript lay beside her, a testament to the horrors they had survived and the secrets yet to be uncovered. Claire knew that St. Mary's had been challenged, but the keeper would endure. Its whispers would linger, its hunger eternal, and she would have to decide whether to flee, report the story, or return to confront the darkness once and for all. The convent had revealed a fraction of its horrors, yet the real challenge, the unraveling of centuries of terror, was only beginning. Claire sank to the cold stone floor of the abandoned crypt, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The nuns she had guided through the hidden passages huddled nearby, their hollowed eyes now partially restored to life, though fear still lingered in every movement. The keeper's presence, though weakened, still loomed in the shadows above, its whispers curling around her mind like tendrils of ice. Clutching the manuscript tightly, Claire began to study the pages she had not yet deciphered. There were drawings and writings that seemed far older than anything else in the convent, symbols so intricate and archaic that they defied conventional understanding. These pages spoke of Mother Elara, the founder of St. Mary's, and the dark covenant she had made. The annotations suggested that Elara had not only summoned the keeper but had bound herself to it, creating a chain of influence that would persist for centuries. The manuscript described a ritual of unimaginable complexity. The sanctum of binding, a series of ceremonies designed to tether the spirits of the faithful to the keeper's will. The choir, the missing nuns, and even subsequent leaders of the convent were all ensnared in this web. What made the keeper so terrifying was not just its power over the living, but its ability to manipulate faith itself, twisting devotion into fear and obedience. Every soul within the convent became both prey and sustainer of its existence. Claire realized something horrifying. The keeper was not just a malevolent spirit. It was an entity born from a combination of ritual, devotion, and the despair of centuries. It had fed and grown stronger with every disappearance, every secret burial beneath the convent, every whispered prayer turned to terror. The keeper was a manifestation of Mother Elara's ambition, a dark legacy that had outlived its creator and consumed the convent itself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, chilling movement. The keeper's shadow flared at the entrance to the crypt, more focused, more aware of her than ever. Its presence was suffocating, yet Claire's mind was sharp. She had read enough to understand that the keeper's tether could be disrupted by confronting its origin. She had to find the original site of the ritual, the heart of the sanctum of binding, where Mother Elara had first summoned it centuries ago. Using the manuscript, Claire led the nuns through a series of hidden corridors and stairwells she had not explored before. The deeper they descended, the older the stone became, rough and worn, etched with symbols that radiated power. The air grew thick with a sense of ancient authority, and every footstep seemed to awaken long-dormant echoes of the past. Finally, they reached a massive chamber buried beneath the oldest part of the convent. The walls were carved with intricate scenes of worship and subjugation, depicting Mother Elara herself, her eyes hollow yet commanding, raising her hands in the invocation of the keeper. At the center of the room was an altar, blackened and scorched by rituals that had lasted centuries. Surrounding it were remnants of offerings, decayed candles, broken chalices, and rotted robes. Claire approached cautiously, noting the faint pulsation of energy emanating from the altar. The manuscript described this as the nexus of binding, the very point where the keeper's essence had been anchored to the convent. To disrupt its power completely, she would need to replicate the counter-ritual, reversing the invocations, severing the tether without destroying the lives of the nuns still partially free. Her hands shook as she traced the protective symbols in a circle around the altar, her breath visible in the icy air. The keeper's presence surged, reacting to her actions with a violent force, attempting to unseat her resolve. Shadows flared and twisted, and she heard the whispers intensify, overlapping into a cacophony of threats, warnings, and mockery. "You cannot undo what has endured centuries. You will fail, join us." Claire ignored the whispers. She opened the manuscript to the final pages, revealing instructions for the counter-ritual. Incantations to reverse the sanctum's power, symbols to invert the original binding, and a crucial component, the invocation of one's own life force as a shield. Fear clawed at her, but she knew that hesitation meant death. She began, her voice trembling yet growing stronger with each word, following the manuscript's guidance. As she spoke, the altar began to glow faintly, the carvings on the walls seeming to shift, reacting to the incantation. Shadows writhed violently, the keeper's form materializing above the altar, a towering figure of darkness and fury, its hollow eyes fixed on her, and for the first time, Claire saw recognition in them, a realization that this intruder was threatening its dominion. The choir, still partially freed, trembled but did not interfere. They watched, caught between fear and the faint spark of autonomy returning to them. Claire's voice grew steadier, echoing through the chamber, blending with the protective symbols she had traced. The keeper lashed out, tendrils of shadow whipping across the room, yet the wards held. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps only moments. Time seemed to bend in the presence of such ancient power. Finally, with one final utterance of the counter-ritual, the keeper's form convulsed violently, screaming in a sound that shook the stone walls. Its essence fractured, the shadows collapsing inward, leaving the chamber eerily silent. The pulsing energy of the nexus dimmed, the aura of oppression lifting as if a centuries-old weight had been removed from the air. The freed nuns collapsed, weeping, trembling, and gasping for breath. They were alive, their souls untethered, but deeply scarred by the experience. Claire herself felt drained, the exertion of wielding her own energy as a shield leaving her nearly unconscious. Yet there was relief, a tentative victory over a force that had held sway for centuries. Looking around the chamber, Claire realized that St. Mary's would never be the same. The keeper's legacy had been severed, the choir freed, and Mother Elara's dark secrets revealed. But the manuscript remained, a reminder that such power could always be awakened again. The convent's history was a cautionary tale, and the horrors within its walls were not easily forgotten. Claire knew that she had survived the keeper's wrath, but she had also glimpsed the thin line between devotion and terror, faith and fear. St. Mary's was no longer merely a building. It was a living testament to the consequences of ambition unchecked by morality. And while the keeper was gone, the echoes of its presence would haunt the halls forever, waiting for the next soul curious or foolish enough to awaken its dark legacy. Claire sank to the cold stone floor of the abandoned crypt, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The nuns she had guided through the hidden passages huddled nearby, their hollowed eyes now partially restored to life, though fear still lingered in every movement. The keeper's presence, though weakened, still loomed in the shadows above, its whispers curling around her mind like tendrils of ice. Clutching the manuscript tightly, Claire began to study the pages she had not yet deciphered. There were drawings and writings that seemed far older than anything else in the convent, symbols so intricate and archaic that they defied conventional understanding. These pages spoke of Mother Elara, the founder of St. Mary's, and the dark covenant she had made. The annotations suggested that Elara had not only summoned the keeper but had bound herself to it, creating a chain of influence that would persist for centuries. The manuscript described a ritual of unimaginable complexity, the sanctum of binding, a series of ceremonies designed to tether the spirits of the faithful to the keeper's will. The choir, the missing nuns, and even subsequent leaders of the convent were all ensnared in this web. What made the keeper so terrifying was not just its power over the living, but its ability to manipulate faith itself, twisting devotion into fear and obedience. Every soul within the convent became both prey and sustainer of its existence. Claire realized something horrifying. The keeper was not just a malevolent spirit. It was an entity born from a combination of ritual, devotion, and the despair of centuries. It had fed and grown stronger with every disappearance, every secret burial beneath the convent, every whispered prayer turned to terror. The keeper was a manifestation of Mother Elara's ambition, a dark legacy that had outlived its creator and consumed the convent itself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, chilling movement. The keeper's shadow flared at the entrance to the crypt, more focused, more aware of her than ever. Its presence was suffocating, yet Claire's mind was sharp. She had read enough to understand that the keeper's tether could be disrupted by confronting its origin. She had to find the original site of the ritual, the heart of the sanctum of binding, where Mother Elara had first summoned it centuries ago. Using the manuscript, Claire led the nuns through a series of hidden corridors and stairwells she had not explored before. The deeper they descended, the older the stone became, rough and worn, etched with symbols that radiated power. The air grew thick with a sense of ancient authority, and every footstep seemed to awaken long-dormant echoes of the past. Finally, they reached a massive chamber buried beneath the oldest part of the convent. The walls were carved with intricate scenes of worship and subjugation, depicting Mother Elara herself, her eyes hollow yet commanding, raising her hands in the invocation of the keeper. At the center of the room was an altar, blackened and scorched by rituals that had lasted centuries. Surrounding it were remnants of offerings, decayed candles, broken chalices, and rotted robes. Claire approached cautiously, noting the faint pulsation of energy emanating from the altar. The manuscript described this as the nexus of binding, the very point where the keeper's essence had been anchored to the convent. To disrupt its power completely, she would need to replicate the counter-ritual, reversing the invocations, severing the tether without destroying the lives of the nuns still partially free. Her hands shook as she traced the protective symbols in a circle around the altar, her breath visible in the icy air. The keeper's presence surged, reacting to her actions with a violent force, attempting to unseat her resolve. Shadows flared and twisted, and she heard the whispers intensify, overlapping into a cacophony of threats, warnings, and mockery. "You cannot undo what has endured centuries. You will fail, join us." Claire ignored the whispers. She opened the manuscript to the final pages, revealing instructions for the counter-ritual. Incantations to reverse the sanctum's power, symbols to invert the original binding, and a crucial component, the invocation of one's own life force as a shield. Fear clawed at her, but she knew that hesitation meant death. She began, her voice trembling yet growing stronger with each word, following the manuscript's guidance. As she spoke, the altar began to glow faintly, the carvings on the walls seeming to shift, reacting to the incantation. Shadows writhed violently, the keeper's form materializing above the altar, a towering figure of darkness and fury, its hollow eyes fixed on her, and for the first time, Claire saw recognition in them, a realization that this intruder was threatening its dominion. The choir, still partially freed, trembled but did not interfere. They watched, caught between fear and the faint spark of autonomy returning to them. Claire's voice grew steadier, echoing through the chamber, blending with the protective symbols she had traced. The keeper lashed out, tendrils of shadow whipping across the room, yet the wards held. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps only moments. Time seemed to bend in the presence of such ancient power. Finally, with one final utterance of the counter-ritual, the keeper's form convulsed violently, screaming in a sound that shook the stone walls. Its essence fractured, the shadows collapsing inward, leaving the chamber eerily silent. The pulsing energy of the nexus dimmed, the aura of oppression lifting as if a centuries-old weight had been removed from the air. The freed nuns collapsed, weeping, trembling, and gasping for breath. They were alive, their souls untethered, but deeply scarred by the experience. Claire herself felt drained, the exertion of wielding her own energy as a shield leaving her nearly unconscious. Yet there was relief, a tentative victory over a force that had held sway for centuries. Looking around the chamber, Claire realized that St. Mary's would never be the same. The keeper's legacy had been severed, the choir freed, and Mother Elara's dark secrets revealed. But the manuscript remained, a reminder that such power could always be awakened again. The convent's history was a cautionary tale, and the horrors within its walls were not easily forgotten. Claire knew that she had survived the keeper's wrath, but she had also glimpsed the thin line between devotion and terror, faith and fear. St. Mary's was no longer merely a building. It was a living testament to the consequences of ambition unchecked by morality. And while the keeper was gone, the echoes of its presence would haunt the halls forever, waiting for the next soul curious or foolish enough to awaken its dark legacy. Claire's legs ached, her body drained from the exertion of performing the counter-ritual. Yet she knew there was no time to rest. The keeper's presence had been fractured, yes, but remnants of its power lingered, twisted and malevolent. The convent itself felt alive in a new way, not as a prison for souls, but as a labyrinth of residual dread. Every corridor seemed to breathe, every shadow whispered, and the echo of the choir's past chants reverberated faintly through the stone walls. The freed nuns followed cautiously, still fragile and shaken by the centuries of possession. Claire led them toward what she hoped was the main exit, consulting the manuscript for clues. The keeper had been strongest in the lower crypts and chambers, but its influence extended throughout the building. She could feel it in the air, cold and oppressive, tugging at her mind with memories not her own. Fleeting glimpses of nuns kneeling for hours, rituals performed under the flicker of candlelight, and the unending chant of the choir. As they moved through the corridors, the shadows shifted unnaturally. Claire's flashlight flickered, illuminating grotesque shapes that seemed almost human, frozen mid-motion, as though the convent's past horrors had been imprinted on the very stones. One of the nuns whispered, trembling, I can see them. The others, they're still here. Claire nodded grimly, realizing that even with the keeper weakened, the remnants of its control, phantoms, echoes of the choir, remained trapped in the architecture. They came to a narrow stairwell that spiraled toward the chapel above. Each step creaked ominously, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. Claire paused at the top of the stairs, listening. There was movement, a fluttering, whispering, coming from the chapel. She had anticipated some resistance, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited. The chapel was in partial ruin. Pews lay splintered, the altar was blackened from old fire, and shattered stained glass allowed moonlight to filter in, casting jagged patterns across the floor. At the far end, a shadow flickered, larger than any human, stretching across the walls. The keeper, though diminished, had gathered what remained of its strength. Its form wavered between smoke and flesh, eyes glowing like coals, tendrils of darkness reaching toward the nuns. Claire stepped forward, holding the manuscript aloft. "Stay behind me," she urged the nuns. Their footsteps were hesitant, but they obeyed. She began to trace the final set of protective symbols on the chapel floor, improvising based on what she had learned in the crypt. The keeper hissed, a sound that pierced the air like knives. Its shadows writhed violently, lashing toward Claire, yet the wards held, pushing the darkness back. The choir's echoes began to manifest, shadowy forms of nuns, remnants of the keeper's earlier control, appearing along the walls. They moved silently, their hollow eyes fixed on Claire, waiting. She knew she had to act quickly. The manuscript described a final ritual to completely sever the keeper's tether to the convent, but it required a willing conduit, someone whose life force could anchor the spell long enough to break the link. Claire realized that she herself had become that conduit by performing the counter-ritual in the crypt. She began the incantation, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The shadows twisted, the keeper's form flaring violently in response. Tendrils lashed at the protective symbols, trying to break them, but Claire held firm, drawing upon her own life energy as a shield. The nuns watched in awe and terror, their newfound freedom fragile, dependent entirely on Claire's strength. The keeper's voice thundered in her mind. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. You belong to me." Claire fought the sensation of despair, focusing on the symbols, the words, the energy she had harnessed. The air around her crackled with tension, and the shadowy forms of the choir twisted and writhed, some reaching out to claw at her, others recoiling from the wards she had drawn. Minutes felt like hours. Claire's voice rose, chanting the final words of the manuscript, her body trembling with exertion. The shadows screamed, twisting into grotesque, impossible forms, then began to collapse inward, dissolving into nothingness. The keeper's form shuddered violently, a final scream that rattled the chapel walls echoing through every stone of the convent. Then silence. The wards held. The shadows were gone. The keeper's essence fractured and scattered, leaving the chapel bathed in pale moonlight. The nuns looked around, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. They were free. The choir's echoes no longer twisted the air, and the oppressive weight of the convent lifted. Claire collapsed to her knees, exhausted beyond measure. The nuns gathered around her, offering support, their hands trembling but steady. One whispered, "You saved us. You freed us." Claire nodded weakly, realizing that the danger was finally over. But she also knew the convent's history would never be forgotten. The keeper's legacy, Mother Elara's ambition, and the centuries of suffering had been confronted and survived, but the scars remained. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the chapel's shattered windows, Claire led the nuns toward the main entrance. The air outside was fresh, the scent of earth and sky replacing the stench of centuries-old darkness. They stepped out into the sunlight cautiously, shielding their eyes, the reality of survival settling in. St. Mary's stood behind them, silent, seemingly calm, but Claire knew better. Its walls held memories of horror that would linger forever, a testament to the dark power that had once ruled within. Claire's mind lingered on the manuscript. She had enough evidence to reveal the horrors of St. Mary's to the world, but she also understood the risk. Some secrets were meant to remain hidden, the keeper's remnants dormant, waiting for the next curious soul. She could only hope that her actions had been enough to break the cycle of terror permanently. As they walked away, Claire looked back one last time. The convent's shadows seemed to retreat, but she could feel faint echoes. A whisper, a movement in the corner of her eye. The keeper was gone, but its presence had left a mark, a darkness that would never fully fade. The choir was free, the nuns alive, and yet St. Mary's would forever be a place of horror and memory, its secrets buried deep in stone, shadows, and time. Claire took a deep breath, leading the nuns toward safety. The manuscript clutched in her hand, a record of terror, courage, and survival. The story was far from over, but they had survived the darkest chapter. And in that moment, Claire understood what it meant to face fear itself and endure. Claire led the nuns down the overgrown path that wound through the convent grounds. The morning light was deceptively serene, painting the centuries-old stones of St. Mary's in warm gold. Yet beneath the calm, she could feel lingering tension, a whisper in the wind, a shadow flitting across her peripheral vision. The keeper may have been fractured, but centuries of ritual had left marks too deep to vanish completely. The nuns whispered among themselves, tentative but alive. Some clutched their rosaries, others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden freedom. Claire offered them small smiles, though her body was trembling from fatigue and fear. She felt a mixture of relief and dread. The keeper had been weakened, yet she knew in her gut that the convent's malevolence might survive, hidden in its walls, waiting for the next curious soul. As they approached the chapel's main entrance, a sudden gust of wind swept through the grounds, carrying the scent of burned candles and decay. The sunlight dimmed momentarily, as if a shadow had passed over the earth itself. Claire froze. The keeper. She turned toward the chapel. The shattered stained glass rattled in its frame. From the ruins, a shadow coalesced, smaller than before, but sharper, angrier. Its form flickered like smoke, tendrils lashing out at the world around it. Though weakened, it still bore the intelligence of an ancient, predatory mind. The keeper's whispers filled her mind, clawing at her thoughts, taunting her. "You think this ends? I am eternal. You cannot erase me. You belong to me." The nuns gasped, backing toward Claire. She instinctively drew a line in the dirt with her foot, a hastily improvised ward from the manuscript. It shimmered faintly, pushing the shadow back slightly, but the keeper did not recoil fully. It was testing, probing, and Claire knew that if she faltered, the centuries of horror would claim them all. One of the nuns, a young woman named Sister Helena, stepped forward. Her eyes were clearer now, her spirit partially restored. She whispered urgently, "We can fight it together. Use the wards. Focus on its tether." Claire nodded, heart pounding. The counter-ritual had worked in the crypt, and she realized they could reinforce it here, using the combined faith and will of the freed choir. The nuns gathered in a circle, holding hands, chanting softly at first, then louder, echoing the ancient incantations Claire had learned from the manuscript. Their voices harmonized, feeding the wards she traced on the ground. The keeper shrieked, the sound neither human nor divine, as the shadows flailed violently against the symbols. For the first time, its control over the convent seemed incomplete, vulnerable to concentrated resistance. Claire stepped forward, chanting the final protective words, her life energy still serving as a conduit for the wards. The keeper's shadow recoiled, pulsing violently, then stretched outward, trying to escape. But the combined strength of the nuns' voices, the wards, and Claire's determination forced it back, containing it in a shrinking sphere of darkness. Every step of the ritual required perfect timing, focus, and courage. One slip, one falter, and the keeper would engulf them all. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadow, not fully formed, yet unmistakable. Mother Elara herself, or rather, a twisted echo of her ambition, her face half human, half shadow, bound to the keeper's essence. She spoke, voice layered over the keeper's whispers. "You cannot undo what I began. Centuries of devotion and fear are mine." Claire's stomach churned. This was the origin of it all, the source of the keeper's power. Every ritual, every tethered soul, every vanished nun traced back to Elara's dark ambition. Yet she could see the weakness. Mother Elara's echo was tied to the keeper, just as the choir had been. If they could sever this final link, the entity might be destroyed or banished permanently. She signaled the nuns. Together, they strengthened the wards, their voices rising to a crescendo. Claire took a deep breath, focusing all her energy, her fear, her resolve, on the central circle. The keeper flailed violently, shrieking, tendrils of shadow smashing against the wards, trying to escape. Mother Elara's echo screamed, twisted in agony, her human features flickering in pain. Then, with a final, forceful utterance, Claire completed the ritual. The wards pulsed with brilliant energy, and the keeper's shadow collapsed in on itself, shrinking rapidly. A deafening roar echoed through the convent as Mother Elara's echo disintegrated into the air, leaving only faint whispers that faded with the wind. The shadows evaporated, the oppressive weight lifted, and the chapel was bathed in sunlight. Birds began to chirp outside. The nuns collapsed to their knees, tears streaming freely. They were finally free, untethered, alive, and whole. Claire slumped against a ruined pew, utterly spent. The keeper, the choir, and Mother Elara's dark legacy had been defeated, or at least neutralized. Yet she knew that St. Mary's would never be a simple building again. Its stones carried the memory of horror, its halls whispers of the past, and its shadows would linger in subtle ways for decades, if not centuries. The nuns helped her to her feet, their hands shaking, yet steady with gratitude. One of them, Sister Helena, whispered, "You gave us a chance, more than we ever dreamed." Claire nodded weakly, looking back toward the ruins of the chapel. The morning sun glinted off the cracked stained glass, illuminating patterns that were no longer twisted, no longer threatening. They walked together toward the convent's gates. The path was overgrown, but now free from malevolent shadows. As they reached the threshold, Claire glanced back one last time. The keeper's final whisper brushed her mind, a faint echo, a warning. "I may sleep, but I never die." She shivered, knowing that some darkness always lingered. But for now, the survivors were free. The choir was gone, the nuns alive, and the keeper's power shattered. The story of St. Mary's, the centuries of terror, and the courage it took to confront the unimaginable had reached its conclusion. Claire clutched the manuscript, knowing it was the record of horrors and triumphs alike. She had survived, documented, and, for the first time, breathed freely. The convent would stand as a reminder. Darkness can endure, but courage, knowledge, and unity can defy even the most ancient of terrors. As they stepped into the sunlight, the air warm and filled with life, Claire allowed herself a long, shaky breath. St. Mary's had tried to claim their souls, but in the end, it had failed. The echoes of horror would remain, but so too would the story of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. The convent loomed behind them, silent now, shadows dissipating, a monument to centuries of ambition, fear, and finally, defeat. 1.